Hello, my friends. When I look at where we are today in Ukraine, I see one thing with absolute clarity. This war is no longer about saving democracy or defending Europe or any of the empty slogans Western politicians keep repeating. It is about power, leverage, and who defines the future security architecture of Europe. And on that battlefield, both military and strategic, Russia is the only actor that actually knows what it wants and has the means, the patience, and the coherence to achieve it. Let me start with this so-called peace plan that everyone keeps talking about. Trump went out and said that Zelensky hasn't even read the proposal, that his people love it and Russia's fine with it, as if Moscow is just waiting eagerly to sign whatever Kushner and a couple of real estate guys bring to the Kremlin. That's nonsense. What exists right now is not a plan. It is a list of talking points, a draft framework, nothing more. The final version that was taken to Moscow by Steve Witkoff and Jared Kushner is not an operational document. A genuine peace plan needs mechanisms, modalities for implementation, timelines, enforcement mechanisms, security guarantees, clear sequencing of steps. None of that exists. What we have is a piece of paper that says, let's discuss these themes. And that's precisely how the Russians are treating it. Moscow has been very careful in how it describes this document. They are not fine with it in the sense of accepting its substance. They have accepted it as a basis for discussion, not as a final settlement. That distinction is crucial. They have repeatedly said, we now have at least a starting point, a text we can dissect, amend, and negotiate. But they have not endorsed its content, and anyone suggesting otherwise either doesn't understand diplomacy or is deliberately misleading people. For 3 years, especially since the summer of 2022, there has been no serious negotiation between Russia on the one side and the collective West on the other. Every time a genuine opening appeared, Istanbul negotiations, early ceasefire contacts, it was the Europeans and the Americans who blocked or sabotaged it. The Russians took note. What they see now is, for the first time in a long while, Washington at least putting something on the table that interests them, not because they are satisfied, but because it proves the Americans finally feel enough pressure to talk. So when I hear that Russia is fine with the plan, I have to laugh. Russia is fine with the existence of a document. They are not fine with being told to swallow something that does not reflect the reality created on the ground by their military superiority. They see this paper as an opening to real negotiations that must happen with serious professionals, not with a bunch of amateurs parachuted in from real estate and political consulting. Right now, the problem is simple. The United States is sending envoys who are not diplomats. Kushner is not a diplomat. Witkoff is not a diplomat. They are not trained negotiators. They are not backed by a coherent strategic vision, and everybody in Moscow knows it. Russia wants real negotiating teams, real diplomats, and a clear sense that what is discussed actually reflects the balance of forces on the battlefield. Until that happens, this plan remains a set of talking points attached to a shifting military reality, and that reality is getting worse every week for Ukraine. This brings me to a point Western elites refuse to internalize. Since October 2022, Russia has been entirely explicit about its military objective. They are not primarily interested in taking land for the sake of it. They are interested in destroying Ukraine's military potential. Not flags on maps, not square kilometers, capability, manpower, infrastructure, logistics, command and control, industrial base, long-range strike assets. Even some Ukrainians have begun to admit this. Julia Mendel, who served as Zelensky's spokeswoman, recently said that it's not about territory, it's about the lives being lost. She's right, even if she doesn't fully grasp what she's saying. When one side is willing to trade time for attrition, and the other side is trading lives to preserve illusions, we already know how that ends. Ukraine is bleeding out. The country is running out of troops. They can mobilize teenagers and grandfathers. They can drag people off the streets into vans. They can chase men fleeing across borders, but none of that changes the basic arithmetic. Russia has more people, more ammunition, more industry, better logistics, and a coherent strategy. Ukraine has Western slogans and a collapsing demographic pool. Russia is therefore in no hurry. They will take what they need, when they need it, and at the tempo that suits them. They can finish this war either on the battlefield or at the negotiating table. But in every realistic scenario, the outcome will be defined on Russian terms. That is the point Europe refuses to confront. The only real choice left to European leaders is not whether Russia wins. Russia has already achieved most of its key objectives. The only choice is to what extent will they allow Ukraine to be destroyed before they finally accept reality. And here, Europe has trapped itself in a hall of mirrors. You listen to people like Kaja Kallas, the Estonian prime minister, and you are stunned by the mixture of ideological fanaticism and strategic illiteracy. She recently said it is wrong to say that Ukraine is losing, and then openly admitted that the first objective is to weaken Russia, with supporting Ukraine coming second. Listen carefully to that formulation. Weakening Russia is the goal. Ukraine is a tool. That is exactly how Moscow reads this policy. Ukraine is being used as a battering ram against Russia, a sacrificial pawn in a broader geopolitical game. And because Western leaders are fixated on weakening Russia rather than stabilizing Europe, they persist in a war that Ukraine cannot win and Europe cannot sustain. Meanwhile, the United States is quietly changing its posture. The new national security strategy makes it quite clear. Washington wants the Europeans to take over the burden of this conflict. This is the burden sharing and burden shifting language. In plain English, it means we, the United States, have bigger priorities, namely China, strategic technology, and rebuilding our own broken society and industry. Europe, you wanted to play the brave defender of freedom against the Russian ogre? Fine, you pay for it. This is not new. Already earlier this year, officials told their allies in Munich that Washington is moving toward a division of labor. Europe is supposed to handle its own security theater, while the U.S. pivots more decisively toward Asia. High-tech competition and securing the Western Hemisphere. The national security strategy just formalizes something that has been evolving for years. So we now see two converging lines. On one side, a draft peace framework being floated that the Europeans have already instinctively resisted because they see it as too favorable to Russia. On the other side, a strategic doctrine in Washington that says, we're not going to keep underwriting this war indefinitely. You, Europeans, have insisted that Ukraine's fight is existential for your security. Now you get to find out what it costs. But Europe has a big problem. It has spent decades hollowing out its own defense capacity. European armies are underfunded, depots are empty, industries are deindustrializing under green ideology and energy self-sabotage, and the political class has never seriously thought about what defense looks like if America steps back. They barked at Russia and assumed Washington would always bring the teeth. Now they stand in front of a wall. Either they defy the U.S. and demand deeper American involvement, which almost certainly implies further escalation, possibly up to the threshold of direct confrontation with Russia, or they accept Washington's burden shifting and admit, in effect, that all their grandstanding of the last 3 years was a lie, because they simply cannot replace what the Americans have been providing. And this is where NATO comes into the picture, not as a solution, but as a structural problem. There is a profound misunderstanding in Europe about what NATO is and what it is for. Countries like Finland and Sweden have treated NATO membership as a kind of magical amulet. Join the alliance and you are instantly safer. But NATO is not a private security company for individual states. It is a collective defense structure designed for one specific kind of war, an all-out nuclear confrontation between East and West on the European continent. NATO is built around nuclear deterrence. That's why it was founded in 1,949 inches, response to the Soviet Union gaining the bomb. Its core purpose is to put European states under the U.S. Nuclear umbrella and to tie American strategic forces to the fate of Europe. That's why U.S. troops are still in Germany. It's not about defending Berlin from a tank column. It's about ensuring that in any existential war in Europe, American soldiers would die on day one, and therefore Washington would have skin in the game. But when you look at Ukraine, you're not looking at the kind of conflict NATO was designed for. NATO is too big conceptually for this war. We are not going nuclear over Ukraine. Nobody sane is proposing that. At the same time, NATO is structurally unable to formally guarantee Ukraine's security, which is why you see this messy patchwork of bilateral security arrangements between Ukraine and individual NATO states instead of NATO itself stepping in. So you end up with the worst of both worlds. On the one hand, NATO expansion, including the rash admission of Finland and Sweden, turns these countries into part of the threat picture from Russia's perspective. Moscow responds accordingly by reinforcing its own deployments along their borders. On the other hand, NATO cannot and will not mobilize fully on Ukraine's behalf without risking nuclear escalation. That's why the alliance remains formally in the background while its member states drip-feed weapons and money and pretend this is some glorious moral crusade rather than a carefully limited proxy war. From the American vantage point, NATO has also served a second function, keeping Europe strategically dependent and politically aligned. From the Baltic states to Poland, Washington found eager partners whose historical grievances against Russia made them natural cheerleaders for every anti-Russian policy, from Iraq to Ukraine. These countries, despite their modest size, punched above their weight inside NATO because they were willing to do what old Europe, France, Germany, Italy often hesitated to do, follow the U.S. line unquestioningly. There is a long history behind this. The Baltic elites, segments of the Ukrainian nationalists, and parts of the Polish establishment have nurtured a deep, almost tribal hostility toward Russia that dates back through World War II, interwar politics, and even earlier. Elements in these societies collaborated with Nazi Germany, framed their identity around anti-Soviet resistance, and later became useful assets for Western intelligence services during the Cold War. That legacy did not vanish in 1991. It was repackaged, sanitized, and then reinserted into NATO as frontline democracies bravely facing the Russian menace. For Washington, this was a gift. Anytime the U.S. wanted to escalate pressure on Moscow, it could count on the Baltic states and Poland to shout the loudest. Within NATO councils, these voices kept dragging the alliance toward confrontation, while the older Western European powers, who often had more to lose economically, were pushed along in a current they no longer fully controlled. The tragedy is that this entire machinery is now running on inertia at the very moment when the United States itself is pulling back. The new American doctrine is brutally simple. We cannot afford to fight endless wars everywhere at once. We need to rebuild our own economy, fix our collapsing education system, restore basic social cohesion, and concentrate resources where they matter most, in the strategic competition with China and in critical technologies like AI, advanced materials, and space. China did not waste decades blowing its wealth on wars of choice. It invested in industry, research, education, and infrastructure. Today, Beijing is a serious competitor, not because it has aircraft carriers in every ocean, but because it has factories, labs, engineers, and a coherent industrial policy. The U.S. is finally waking up to that reality and asking itself, why did we spend so much blood and treasure on Iraq, Afghanistan, Libya, Syria, and now this proxy war in Ukraine, wars that made us weaker instead of stronger? The answer, of course, is the military-industrial complex, which profited enormously from all of this. But those profits are concentrated in a small sliver of American society. For the country as a whole, these wars have been a strategic disaster. So Washington is adjusting. It is not giving up its ambition for global dominance. Let's be clear about that. It still wants to be the top dog, setting rules and punishing anyone who disobeys. But it has accepted that to do this, it needs to rearm economically and technologically. That means prioritizing. Europe and Ukraine are no longer at the top of the list. China is. The Pacific is. Critical tech is. Ukraine is a drain, not an asset. Where does that leave Europe? In a very dark place. European leaders have chosen to imitate America's worst habits. At the very moment America is trying to stop, they are sacrificing their own economies, their societies, their industrial base, just to weaken Russia. They have strangled their energy lifeline from Russia, sent their weapons stockpiles eastward, scared away foreign investors, and plunged themselves into inflation, deindustrialization, and rising social unrest, all for a war they cannot win, and that increasingly does not matter to Washington's long-term priorities. Foreign investment in Europe is at its lowest level in years. Confidence is evaporating. The very moment when European states most need external financing to service their debts and rebuild their economies is precisely the moment when investors are looking elsewhere. That is not an accident. Investors can see that Europe has chosen ideology over realism. They can see that the continent's leaders are willing to follow Washington into a head-on confrontation with Russia, while the Americans quietly step back and say, "You've got this." Meanwhile, Russia sits on the other side of the front line, watching all of this unfold with cold, patient calculation. Moscow knows that it does not need to storm every trench or occupy every village to win. It simply needs to continue grinding down Ukraine's military capacity, maintain strategic pressure, and let Europe's political and economic contradictions ripen. As Putin himself said recently, if Ukraine refuses negotiations on realistic terms, Russia will achieve its objectives by military means. For Moscow, both paths are acceptable. For Europe, neither path looks good, but one of them, the diplomatic path, at least offers a way to limit the scale of Ukraine's destruction and salvage some stability for the continent. The catch is that diplomacy requires trust, and Europe has burned every bridge it had with Moscow. Since 2014, the Europeans have lied, broken agreements, and used negotiations simply to buy time for Ukraine to arm itself. The Minsk Accords were a textbook example. They were never meant to be implemented. They were a deception. Russia has not forgotten that, and it has no reason to take European leaders at their word now that the military tide is decisively turning in its favor. So, where does this end? It ends where it was always going to end, on Russian terms. That does not mean Russia gets everything, or that some absolutist caricature of victory is imposed. It means that the fundamental security concerns of Russia, no NATO in Ukraine, no hostile military infrastructure on its doorstep, no existential threat from the West, will be respected in whatever settlement emerges, whether de facto through battlefield realities or de jure through a negotiated framework. Europe still has one narrow margin of maneuver left. It can decide how far down the path of devastation it wants Ukraine to travel before accepting that outcome. It can keep feeding men and weapons into a war that Russia is prepared to prolong as long as necessary, or it can admit what everyone in Moscow already knows, that this war cannot be won on the battlefield by Ukraine, that NATO cannot deliver the miracle, and that a new security architecture in Europe will have to be built with Russia, not against it. If European leaders were serious, they would stop fantasizing about some future collapse of Russia and start thinking about how to restore a concept that the Soviets themselves once proposed: security through cooperation, not confrontation. That was the original spirit behind the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe. The West hijacked that structure, emptied it of meaning, and turned back to NATO as the primary instrument of power. Now, the bill for that choice is coming due. In the end, the great irony is this: the war launched to weaken Russia has, in practice, weakened Europe far more, exposed NATO as conceptually unfit for modern conflicts like Ukraine, accelerated Washington's pivot away from the continent, and pushed Russia into a position where it can dictate the terms of any realistic settlement. The West set out to break Russia and remake Europe. Instead, Russia is reshaping Europe's strategic reality without needing to march on Berlin or Paris. All it had to do was refuse to lose, refuse to bend, and let the illusions of its adversaries collapse under the weight of their own contradictions.